Okay, the title of this talk is King Arthur and the Victorians, and the picture is by Charles Ernest Butler in 1903. It is moving, good. The story of Arthur begins in the dark, backward and abysm of time, with the withdrawal of the legions by Stilicho in 407, the sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410, the groans of the Britons to Aetius Consul in 446, as recorded by Gildas in his Jeremiad-like history, De Excidio et Conquisto Britanniae, written 100 years later. If Arthur had existed, he would have been a contemporary of Gildas. Its geographical home is such magical places as Mons Botanicus, Tintagel, Glastonbury, Winchester, Snowdonia, and the Scottish borders. It gave us such household names as Gwynevere, Lancelot, Galahad, and Merlin. And it's found in the writings of Gildas, Nennius, Geoffrey of Monmouth, Wace, Laomon, Chrétien de Troyes, Thomas Mallory, and Edmund Spenser. It was used for political purposes by the Normans, the Plantagenets, and the Tudors. Milton, however, chose to justify the ways of God to man rather than those of Arthur and his knights. And the Age of Enlightenment chose reason over medieval myth. So the once and future king slept for a while before being awakened at the end of the 18th century and coming again to dominate the popular consciousness in the 19th, following a revival of interest in all things medieval. But let us begin with this gentleman, Thomas Chatterton, who died in 1770. This is a painting by Henry Wallace in 1856. The interest in medievalism had much to do with the movement in modes of thought, from the classical to the romantic at the end of the 18th century. This was the age of Gilpin and the picturesque, the search for the sublime, the Gothic in literature and architecture, the desirability of ruins for meditation and reflection. If you weren't lucky enough to have a ruin like Tintern Abbey in your landscape gardens, then you could always get a Capability Brown or a Humphrey Repton to build a turreted folly for you instead. Romanticism was challenging classicism as the dominant mode of thought, so that poets and artists were beginning to celebrate the power of the imagination over reason. And none represented the tragic romantic poet, a slave to his imagination, better than the marvelous boy poet Thomas Chatterton, who in 1770, when penniless and in despair that nobody wanted to buy his poetry, poisoned himself with arsenic at the tender age of 17. He had claimed that his poems had had a medieval origin, just like James Macpherson, the Scottish poet and forger of Ossian 10 years earlier, and like Bishop Thomas Percy, who discovered such medieval ballads as Sir Patrick Spens and published them in 1765 as Percy's Relics. The Victorian period which followed would see an explosion of interest in all things medieval, and that would lead to the explosion of all things Arthurian. That's a close-up of Henry Wallace's picture from 1856. He should perhaps have kept a closer eye on the young model, George Meredith, who later became a successful novelist, because he subsequently ran off to France with Wallace's wife. But in terms of the medievalism, the poet Blake, the visionary and revolutionary poet, not only was he a fan of Geoffrey Chaucer, as the Canterbury Tales engraving shows from 1810, but also gave us England's most famous Arthurian song, which has in its time graced cathedrals, rugby stadia, and the WI, namely Jerusalem. And the Arthurian connection burst into song, by the way, if the urge takes you at this moment. The first two stanzas refer to the legend that the Christ child came to Glastonbury in England with his uncle Joseph of Arimathea and walked upon England's mountains green. Joseph was later supposed to have returned with the Holy Grail. It was also the time of the Gothic novels. It was the Horace Walpole in 1764, Anne Radcliffe in 1794, and Monk Lewis in 1796, who chose appropriately medieval settings for their novels. And Walpole, of course, also created the neo-Gothic mansion Strawberry Hill so that he could live out his neo-Gothic fantasies. It was the age of Scott, who died in 1832 before Victoria came to the throne, but whose novels were read long afterwards. He lived in a neo-Gothic baronial mansion at Abbotsford near Melrose, which he designed himself in 1818. He wrote Lochinvar about medieval reivers, then a Lake District romance which includes the tale of a knight saving the daughter of King Arthur, entitled The Bridal of Triamain, and of course Ivanhoe. Ivanhoe was said to have inspired Archibald, the Earl of Eglinton, to hold a reenactment of the medieval joust in August 1839 at his Ayrshire Castle home, in which 13 members of the aristocracy and many distinguished visitors, such as Prince Louis Napoleon, the future Emperor of the French, took part. Despite pouring rain and the expected scorn of the Whigs, it attracted 100,000 spectators. It was the British aristocracy's attempt to revive chivalry and Arthurian ideals at the beginning of Victoria's reign. And then, of course, there were the painters. By the time Victoria came to the throne, medievalism was very much in vogue and was enthusiastically adopted as a setting by the painters of the day. Here's Frederick Sandys in 1858 with the story of Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, the wife of Henry II. She's on her way to poison her husband's mistress, Fair Rosamond. That's why she's grasping a dagger in case the poison should fail. And then on the right hand, a later painting by John William Waterhouse from 1916, showing Rosamond looking longingly out of the window while Eleanor peeks threateningly behind the curtain, ready to strike. The historical Eleanor, by the way, was a great lover of Arthurian romance, and it was her daughter, Countess Marie, who was the patron of Chrétien de Troyes, the 12th century poet who first gave us Lancelot, Camelot, and the Grail legend. And while we're on it, Henry II was also interested in the legend. It was he in 1191, supposedly on the advice of a Breton bard, directed the monks to where Arthur and Guinevere were supposedly buried at Glastonbury. And he is said to have set up a retreat for himself and Rosamond at Woodstock in imitation of the love nest of Tristan and Isolde. And of course, there was Chaucer. Medievalism and subjects from literature were beginning to challenge the artist's traditional subjects from the classical myths or biblical tales. Here's Ford Madox Brown is Chaucer at the court of Edward III, which was exhibited in 1851. And we can't forget Dante. It wasn't just English literature. Dante Gabriel Rossetti, one of the founders of the Pre-Raphaelites, painted several paintings recalling the love of his namesake Alighieri Dante for his Beatrice. Here, Dante's Beata Beatrix of 1870, and Dante's Dream on the Day of her Death, 1880. His Italian professor father was not only a political exile, but also a Dante specialist. Rossetti's paintings were arguably inspired as much by his love of medievalism as his love of Lizzie Siddal and Jane Morris, shown here. The Pre-Raphaelites, of course, by definition, were a group for whom the high Middle Ages represents an ideal. And what about another painting by Rossetti, based on the story of Paolo and Francesca by Dante, which inspired Rodin's The Kiss. Paolo and Francesca was an adulterous relationship stimulated by reading the Arthurian romances of Lancelot and Gwynevere. In Dante's Inferno, they are quite rightly condemned to spend eternity roped together and driven by the winds that circulate around hell. Dangerous stories, these Arthurian romances, but I don't think at all on King Arthur it's like to have the same effect. And then there were the poets that, like Keats, who wrote the Eve of St. Agnes, and a medieval subject, which appealed to the Pre-Raphaelites as well. So here's Millet's 1863 treatment of Keats' love poem. It shows Madeleine about to undress while Porphyro hides in the room to watch her before appearing as if in a dream as her future husband. And the same story with Holman Hunt, showing the flight of Madeleine and Porphyro later in the story, and that one was painted in 1848. And another well-liked poem was by Keats, was Isabella and a Pot of Basil. Here in Millet's first ever painting, according to Pre-Raphaelite principles, painted in 1849, Millet shows the brothers plotting to murder Isabella's lover, Lorenzo. Note the PRB next to the yellow stockings. And more Isabella and the Pot of Basil. Several artists depicted the later part of the poem. Lorenzo's murdered, and on finding this out from Lorenzo's ghost, Isabella digs him up and keeps his head hidden in a pot of basil, as you do. Here we've got the dastardly deed taking place through the window in John Strudwick's 1879 painting, and two versions of Isabella hugging her favourite flower pot. Holman Hunt's 1868 painting on the left, and John William Waterhouse's 1917 painting on the right, and slowly going mad. It is the only way to get ahead. And then one of my favourites, La Belle Dame sans Merci. The Victorians loved a femme fatale, from the Middle Ages. Here are two versions of the legend of the knight stolen away to fairyland, as in the ballad Tam Lin, based on Keats' poem La Belle Dame sans Merci. The first is by Frank Dixie from 1901, and the second by John William Waterhouse from 1893. Fairies were, of course, not twee little sprites, but tall, commanding, and seductively beautiful creatures who could be cruel or kind, the femme fatale who the Victorians liked. But to get specifically Arthurian, here's Frederick Sandys' Morgan Le Fay. She's another fairy, hence the Fay, and a femme fatale, this time direct from the Arthurian legend. In this picture, she's no longer the healer from Avalon, the island of apples, in Geoffrey of Monmouth's original, but the evil, scheming half-sister of Arthur, full of hate for her brother, who here plots his downfall by weaving a poisoned cloak for him. Frederick Sandys in 1864 shows her standing in front of an enchanted loom. In another story, she steals his magical scabbard, Arthur's magical scabbard, which protects him from shedding of his blood, and again is the one responsible for turning Sir Bertilac into the Green Knight and forcing his lady to seduce Gawain and therefore betray his vow of chivalry in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. But the big moment for Arthurian literature came with the reissuing, if not the rediscovery, of Malory's Morte d'Arthur. The original had been written when the author was imprisoned at Newgate during the Wars of the Roses for rape, extortion, attempted murder, and striking an abbot, not necessarily in that order, and possibly trumped up charges because he had changed sides. And it's in Newgate where he would die in 1471. It was one of the first books printed and published by Caxton in 1486, and one of the most popular books in the late Middle Ages and Tudor period. Two editions were published in 1816, based on the 1634 edition illustrated here, but it was a luxury edition with a scholarly introduction by Robert Southey, the poet laureate, published by Thomas Davison the following year in 1817, that really caught the reading public's imagination. And so there were editions published throughout the century, and they culminated in this particular one by Aubrey Beardsley in 1894. So we've rushed to the end of the century. It was lavish in its production. It's published by Dent, and of course it was very aesthetic in its representations. So that's the Aubrey Beardsley. There's more illustrations from the Aubrey Beardsley 1894 Morte d'Arthur. They tend to be highly sexually charged, even sarcastic in their approach to the Round Table. The pre-Raphaelites hated them, but they do reflect the new fashion for Art Nouveau. Here the Lady of the Lake telleth Arthur of the sword Excalibur, one of two swords associated with King Arthur. And the reason why Dent wanted to produce such a lavish and controversial edition was a response to the work of this man, the great medievalist William Morris. He had been a lover of the Arthurian legends from 1853 when he went to Exeter College in Oxford and formed a close and lifelong friendship with a fellow Arthurian, the painter Burne-Jones. They toured the cathedrals of northern France together and spent a lifetime in art, design, and literature, celebrating all that was medieval and Arthurian. Morris famously read Malory's text aloud to Burne-Jones and Rossetti while they painted images of Arthurian scenes in Rossetti's studio. Together with the architect Philip Webb, Morris designed a red house in Bexley Heath, southeast London, a bit of a medieval folly, and set up Morris and Company to promote the arts and crafts movement based on the principles of medieval craftsmanship. In 1891, he set up the Kelmscott Press from his Hammersmith house, named after his Oxfordshire manor house, Kelmscott House, and produced beautiful manuscript editions of over 50 books, many illustrated by his lifelong friend Burne-Jones. Of these, the finest achievement was the 1896 Kelmscott Chaucer, illustrated here and described by W.B. Yeats, and I'm sure by many other people, as the most beautiful of all printed books. But he also wrote poetry and did one painting. So Arthur's queen, Gwynevere, had an adulterous affair with Lancelot and was blamed by the Victorians for the bitter civil war which destroyed Camelot. So she's another femme fatale in that sense. Here, though, Morris, in his poem, presents Gwynevere in a positive light. On trial before Sir Gawain, he shows her giving a spirited, unapologetic defence of the remembered bliss, which was her love for Lancelot, despite her inevitable condemnation to be burnt at the stake. At the end of the poem, you get the sounds, strange sounds appearing, and don't worry, this is her hero Lancelot approaching to rescue her. So do not despair. The painting by Morris, the only one he did, was for a long time regarded as a painting of Guinevere, but it is in fact another Arthurian heroine, La Belle Isolde. The dog on the bed is a clear giveaway. I will come to La Belle Isolde in a little while. And the model here is the 18-year-old Jane Burden. It's interesting how his defence of Guinevere contrasts with that of Tennyson. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So let's go back to 1834 and the Westminster Fire, as painted here by Turner. The Houses of Parliament were destroyed and so had to be rebuilt. The contract to rebuild was given, as we know, to Charles Barry, the neo-Gothic architect, who drew up plans for a Gothic revival palace in 1835, and Augustus Pugin, who designed the furniture and interiors of this vast neo-Gothic cathedral for the modern world. So the first stone was laid in 1840 and had completed the Lords and Commons chambers by 1852. And the Arthurian connection, apart from it being a neo-Gothic building, is the robing room. Prince Albert himself was put in charge of the Fine Arts Commission, tasked with choosing an artist for a series of murals in the Queen's robing room. He chose William Dyce, a Scottish artist, perhaps best known for his painting of Pegwell Bay. He began his commission in 1848 and hadn't completed it by his death in 1864. He chose a pre-Renaissance style of frescoes and the Arthurian legends as his theme. Prince Albert wasn't averse to comparing himself and Queen Victoria to King Arthur and Guinevere, or dressing up as such, as this painting by Landseer on the right shows. They even named their seventh child and third son Arthur. And you may also recognise the picture of modern-day royalty in the Queen's robing room as Barack Obama at the bottom there. And it consisted of a series of murals taking a specific chivalric quality and trying to illustrate it. So Dyce chose an idealized, he felt that these chivalric qualities were embodied by the monarchy. So here we've got courtesy, represented by Sir Tristram of Lyonesse, playing his harp to the delight of La Belle Isolde. And then in the middle, you've got mercy, represented by Sir Gawain, swearing to be merciful to all women, though you may need to forget the fact that in Morte d'Arthur, he condemned Gwynevere to be burnt at the stake, as we've just seen. And on the right, generosity, represented by King Arthur, who's unhorsed, spared by Sir Lancelot in battle when they fought against each other, following Lancelot's rescue of Gwynevere from the stake, during which he killed the round table knight brothers of Gawain, Gareth and Gaheris. So it was a bit of a mess, really. In the heat of battle, Lancelot put Arthur back on his horse, mounted his own and rode away. A young Disraeli, who had earlier been at the centre of the Young England movement between 1842 and 1845, which advocated a paternalistic, feudalistic form of government based on chivalrous ideals, would have no doubt approved. But we'll just look at some more of these murals from the Queen's robing room. There is here the Knights of the Round Table about to depart in their quest for the Holy Grail. And a detail of the same painting, they're about to depart. And I think I'll just be quiet and let you enjoy the next one, the hospitality, the admission of Sir Tristram to the Fellowship of the Round Table. And I'll keep quiet and have a drink while you just watch the next 6 slides from the same painting. You can see why it wasn't finished by the time he died. 1857, William Dyce had earlier been associated with the Nazarenes and is said to have been the artist who introduced John Ruskin to the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And it was Ruskin who had commissioned 3 of the second wave of Pre-Raphaelites to lead the paintings of the frescoes at the newly built Oxford Union Debating Hall in Oxford. Dante Gabriel Rossetti had already approached his friend, the architect Benjamin Woodward, and offered to paint the murals for free board and lodging and endless supplies of soda water, which is quite a cheap price, really, rather than being paid. And this was during the long vacation of 1857. With him were Edward Burne-Jones and William Morris, along with Val Prinsep, Arthur Hughes, J.H. Pollen, and Spencer Stanhope, as well as Alexander Munro, the sculptor, who's not illustrated. Unfortunately, only J.H. Pollen had any experience of frescoes, and they soon began to flake and the bright colours fade even before the murals were completed. There was a suggestion 10 years later that the whole thing should be whitewashed, but thankfully that suggestion was ignored. And that's again, the frescoes, of which they completed 7, were based on Malory's Morte d'Arthur, but Tennyson's Arthurian poetry was also being published at this time and was a major inspiration. Despite the technical difficulties, they described this period as a joyous time in their lives. The poet Charles Angelin Swinburne, the son of an admiral who was a student at Balliol at the time, became part of the group and would go on to write his own version of the Tristram and Isolde legend in 1882, called Tristram of Lyonesse, which reacted against the conventional morality of Tennyson. So another view of the room. A close-up of Rossetti's Sir Lancelot's vision of the Holy Grail, based on Jane Burden as his model. Morris married her 2 years later, and Rossetti took over as her lover 10 years after that. And Jane Burden again, this time as Gwynevere. Lancelot was modelled on Burne-Jones. He was fast asleep at Gwynevere's feet and barred from entering the Grail Castle. And here's the death of Merlin by Burne-Jones. Millet had been asked, did he want to take part, but he turned it down. He was busy doing another painting in 1857. This one called Sir Isumbras at the Ford, a nice medieval subject, but it obviously wasn't his best. The horse is too big. It was given lots of negative comments by Ruskin because of the horse, I think. And perhaps even more shocking for him, Frederick Sandys did a parody, which he called A Nightmare, and which satirized it. So here, you've got Millet as the knight, Rossetti as the caricatured as the child on the left, and Holman Hunt as the child on the right, while the donkey has Ruskin's initials, J.R. Oxon, on its rump. Rather than causing a rift, it led to his being befriended by Rossetti, though, and subsequently invited him to join the Pre-Raphaelites. So that was at 1857. By 1862, after the Oxford, 4 years after the Oxford Union, Morris, Burne-Jones and Rossetti were again commissioned to create an Arthurian-themed work of art, this time for a wealthy Yorkshire textile industrialist, Walter Dunlop. He had used his wealth to obtain a country estate in West Yorkshire near Bingley. It's called Harden Grange, in order to establish himself as a member of the landed gentry. So in 1861, Morris and Co. had begun working on stained glass. It was this they were asked to design for the music room at Harden Grange. As well as Rossetti and Burne-Jones, Morris also asked Val Prinsep and Arthur Hughes, who had worked on the Oxford murals, and Ford Maddox Brown, who was a partner with him in the firm. By 1861, then, the interest in all things Arthurian had moved out of the academic world into that of the merchant classes, who saw a familiarity with the legends of King Arthur as a mark of status. Now, the subject that Morris chose had been the focus of the part of the Oxford murals that he took charge of, and the subject of the painting by Morris we have already seen, the story of Tristram and Isolde. Other variations of their names, of course, are available. This French romance became part of the matter of Britain in the interweaving of legends with the Arthur story, which took place in about 1230. Its popularity among Victorians is evident from its frequent representation in art, music, and poetry. For example, by Swinburne, whom we've already mentioned, and Matthew Arnold, whom we haven't. Isolde here is in Frank Dixie's 1901 portrait. She's the daughter of the Irish king, whose knight champion, Sir Moreholt, or Marhouse in some versions, had come to Cornwall to demand tribute, but who had been defeated by Tristram. And he was the champion of the King of Cornwall, King Mark. By this means, King Mark had won her hand in marriage in place of tribute. Moreholt's head had been sent back into Ireland with the shard of Tristram's sword still in it. Later, Tristram was sent over to bring Isolde back from Ireland and fought a dragon while there. Now, while he suffered from some injuries from this brave action, and while being treated for his injuries by Isolde, she noticed the notch in his sword, which exactly fitted the shard at the head of exactly fitted the shard in the head of Moreholt, so she vowed revenge. However, on the ship on the return journey to Tintagel, Tristram and Isolde unwittingly drank a love potion intended for King Mark's wedding night, and from then on they would be sotted with each other, as you see from John William Waterhouse's 1916 picture on the left and Edmund Leighton's 1902 picture clearly suggest. She marries King Mark because she has to, but carries on a doomed love affair with Tristram. As you can imagine, King Mark, seen creeping up the stairs in the Edmund Leighton picture, isn't too happy about this, and you can probably guess what happens next. Yes, inevitably, I'm afraid I've had to go to 1922 for this one, this N.C. Wyeth's illustration. But the inevitable happens. When Tristram is happily harping away, King Mark creeps up behind him and splits his skull open. Despite the obvious adultery, this was a bit of a treacherous act, as after running away together and finding refuge in Lancelot's castle, Tristram had returned and handed Isolde back to her husband. The story has similarities with the Lancelot and Gwynevere stories, and so may have had a common source. We ought also to say that on their wedding night, Isolde had very cunningly got her maid to take her place in the marriage bed, so that the marriage wasn't consummated, so she could carry on her affair with Tristram. So it's similarities with Lancelot and Guinevere. And the death of Tristram and Isolde. This is by a German painter called August Spiess, who from 1881, and it's about the two lovers being reunited in death. Now, you may well be asking, what has all this got to do with King Arthur, apart from the fact they were both born in Tintagel or had associations with Tintagel? And the answer is nothing and everything. Once the story of Arthur had been written down by Geoffrey Monmouth, it became like a vast vacuum cleaner. That's the American Arthurian scholar Dorsey Armstrong's term, gathering all sorts of different legends to it. And one of these was, of course, that of Tristram and Isolde. There are many different versions of their names and many different versions of their story, but I'll simply let you enjoy the stained glass windows from Harden Grange without too much interruption. So these are the stained glass windows that Morris & Company produced. Let's return to that one in a minute. Confusion alert. There are two Isoldes. This is the Le Blanchement, the Isolde of the White Hands is the one he marries, Tristan marries, because she feels, she heals him of poison arrow wound, because he likes the name, obviously, and because he thinks it will help him get over his obsession with Isolde, the La Belle Isolde, the one who's now married to King Mark. So Isolde Le Blanchement is the King of Brittany's granddaughter, but he doesn't consummate his marriage as he's in love with her namesake. Meanwhile, as I've said, Isolde has prevented Mark discovering that Isolde is not a virgin by substituting her maidservant Regan to take her place in the marriage bed. But Dunlop wasn't the only industrialist to capitalise on the Arthurian legends. William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones were again in partnership, promoting the legends of King Arthur in 1891. This time their commission was from the wealthy Australian industrialist William Knox Darcy, who felt that his dining room at his Stanmore Hall mansion needed a little decoration. He contacted Morris & Co. and they suggested something on the theme of the Holy Grail. It's near Elstree, I believe, Stanmore Hall. Now, the Saint Graal, the Sangreal, or the Holy Grail, had become a central part of the Arthurian legend from 1180, when Chrétien de Troyes wrote an unfinished romance about the knight Percival. Originally, it had been a dish, or in Celtic legend, or sometimes a stone. But as the legend developed to specifically Christian focus, it came to represent both the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper and the cup that Joseph of Arimathea used to collect Christ's blood after the crucifixion, when the body was laid in the tomb. And it's the one he took to Glastonbury, seen here in this detail from Rossetti's painting of the Damsel of the Saint Graal of 1857. There's not one Grail legend, but many, as the stories were told over the centuries, with pre-Christian Celtic elements, such as the cauldron which confers immortality, the vessel that provides life-giving food and drink and is always replenished, and the fearsome lance of a Celtic god, all assimilated into the later Christian legend. Some have seen the lance and cup as pagan fertility symbols. The search for the Holy Grail is a search for an object of awesome sanctity, which holds the secret of life and confers immortality. I say there are many variations of the Grail story, but many start with the appearance of the Grail to the knights at the Round Table, as here in this 15th century French manuscript of the prose Lancelot 1475. They're then filled with the uncontrollable desire to see it again and set out in search of it for a year and a day. The Grail Quest thus became the ultimate goal of a knight, both spiritual and existential, a search for the meaning of life and one's true self. It would culminate in an unparalleled mystical experience and a union with the divine. On the way, the knight was likely to encounter many trials and many temptations, as in the temptation of Sir Percival, here in an 1894 painting by Arthur Hacker. The Grail Castle, where according to Chrétien de Troyes is where the Saint Graal is seen, was guarded by King Pelles, the Fisher King, a powerful monarch who had been wounded in the thigh and whose lands, as a consequence, had been laid waste and turned into a desert. In Celtic mythology, kings were closely and magically linked with the life and fertility of their lands. He and his land can only be healed if the Grail Quester asks the right questions. In Chrétien de Troyes, Percival, for instance, reaches the Grail Castle, but fails to ask the crucial question about the procession he witnessed. If only he asked why the lance bled and where the Grail procession was going, then the king and the land would have been healed, but he didn't. This motif varies from story to story, but it was, of course, later taken up by T.S. Eliot as the central image at the heart of his poem, The Wasteland. Sir Galahad, of course, in the Quest for the Holy Grail by Arthur Hughes. It's Sir Galahad on the right by George Frederick Watts from 1860 in that picture. And here we've got another Sir Galahad, this time being led by angels in an 1870 painting by Arthur Hughes. And then you've got this painting by Rossetti of 1864, which shows the achievement of the Holy Grail by Sir Galahad. He was the only one who actually managed to get close to it, with Sir Percival and Sir Bors behind him, and Sir Percival's sister Dindrain, a nun who sacrificed herself on the way to help leprous women. But this is what the Stanmore Hall had employed Morris & Company to do, to put up these beautiful frescoes. So Morris and Burne-Jones considered the quest for the Holy Grail as the most beautiful and complete episode in the Arthurian legend. They completed 6 tapestries for Stanmore Hall over a 4-year period, with silk threads woven into them to enhance the colours. Here you get a mysterious damsel arriving to summon them to undertake the quest. The figures are by Burne-Jones. The chairs and the other accessories across Stanmore Hall were by William Morris. Note Sir Galahad's chair, the one on the left there, which is empty, which is the Siege Perilous. It's left empty because only he is holy enough to sit there. A later Christian reinterpretation of the chair of Judas at the Last Supper, but here the seat at which all but the most perfect knight will die. And this in the tapestries leads to the arming and the departure of the knights. The knights are saying goodbye to their ladies, with the rare exception of the Grail Quest, with a rare exception, possibly the nun we've just seen. The Grail Quest is an all-male affair. And another tapestry is of the ship, which bore the questing knights to Saras, a mystical land, a kingdom, an island in Arabia where the Grail is to be found, sometimes identified with Jerusalem, where the citizens made Sir Galahad king. Not everybody can can achieve the Grail Quest. Here's Sir Lancelot, not allowed to enter the Chapel of the Holy Grail. And also, like the adulterer Lancelot, Owain, sometimes goes by the name of Yvain in French, or Owain in English, and the son of Morgan Le Fay also was forbidden to enter. But the vision was seen by Sir Galahad, and Percival on the extreme left there, and Sir Bors got pretty close, but not as close as Sir Galahad. So if Lancelot stands for Adam, the imperfect man destroyed by lust, his son Sir Galahad represents Christ, the second Adam, or man perfected. He's only one of 2 knights of the Round Table who remains a virgin. Percival is the other. For Tennyson, chastity is somewhat synonymous with virtue. Most knights never get near to the Grail, though, because they are not pure enough. And it's only Sir Galahad, the son of Sir Lancelot and Elaine of Courbeneck, who, of course, because of his adultery with Gwynevere, has no chance, who can get close to the Grail, though Sir Percival and Sir Bors are able to see it from a distance. Angels bore Galahad's souls to heaven. Percival became a hermit, and Sir Bors made his way back to Camelot, where he was greeted with great rejoicing. And there's a more detail of the same. And again. However, the cult of King Arthur was alive and well in Victorian Britain, but these two had a big part in making it even more prominent. William Morris and his associates were, as we've seen, key figures, but these two remarkable contemporaries played a big role as well. They are, of course, Alfred Lord Tennyson on the right, 1809 to 1892, the poet laureate admired by Queen Victoria, who used Arthur to celebrate England and the British Empire, and perhaps less well-known Lady Charlotte Guest, 1812 to 1895, who inspired a new spirit of Welsh nationalism. So we'll start with Lady Charlotte Guest and with Wales. Even before Geoffrey of Monmouth, Wales had long been the romantic setting for the legends of King Arthur. Here's Turner's Dolbaden Castle near Llanberis. Here's Mount Snowdon, where I would for years point out to groups of children when we walked up there, the cave next to Glaslyn, where the knights were sleeping, and the cairn on Bulk East Scythiau, under which the Rex Quondam Rexque Futurus lies until his country's hour of need. Where's he been the last few years, I ask? and Cadair Idris, the chair of Arthur, near Dolgelly. On the Isle of Anglesey, there's a village called Gwalchmai, and Gwalchmai is the Welsh name for Gawain. And according to the Black Book of Carmarthen, Bedivere, the Welsh name of Bedivere, is buried in Tryfan, my favourite Welsh mountain. The stories of King Arthur have their roots in Wales. So the 9th century monk Nennius, who lists Arthur's 12 battles, the unnamed monk who wrote the Annals Cambriae, written in Latin in about 986, and the 12th century Geoffrey of Monmouth were all from Wales. Here's Thomas Jones's 1774 picture of a Welsh bard. There's a strong bardic tradition in Wales where stories of Arthur were passed down by word of mouth until collected in medieval manuscripts. And there are 5 main Welsh texts: the Black Book of Carmarthen about 1250, the Book of an Ireland 1265, the White Book of Rutherk about 1325, the Book of Taliesin 1325 again, the Red Book of Hengist about 1400. Godothin, which is in the talk in the middle there, is a poem included in the Book of Aneurin, and it tells the tale of 300 warriors in the Scottish lowlands who died fighting the Angles of Catterick. If this is not a later interpolation, as it might be, it contains the first mention of Arthur by name, if indeed it was composed by the bard Aneurin in AD 600. Charlotte Guest will, of course, later draw on these tales for her Mabinogion. I must mention that this place, though, it's a favourite with me. There were lots of other tales passed down by word of mouth. Here is that Dinas Emrys in Beth Gelert in Snowdonian. You may recall that Beth Gelert means the grave of Gelert, and get your tissues out. The faithful dog that Llywelyn the Great slaughtered when he mistook the blood on the dog's fangs as that of his child, rather than the wolf the dog had killed to protect the baby. But Dinas Emrys holds an even stranger tale, told by both Nennius and Geoffrey of Monmouth. Vortigern, you know, the one who brought over Hengist and Horsa, according to the legend, the treacherous king who had first invited the Saxons over, couldn't build a castle at the top of Dinas Emrys, because each night the walls kept on falling down. His advisors told him that the only cure was to scatter the blood of a fatherless child over the foundations. The boy was found, someone whose father had been a demon, but whose mother was virtuous, and he was about to be sacrificed when he shouted, "Hang on, lads, I know what it might be. In the heart of the mountain, underneath your foundations, there's a pool, and inside the pool, 2 hollow stones, and inside the stones, 2 fire-breathing dragons at war with each other, a red one and a white one." And so rather than slaughtering him, they dug down and found he was correct and spared his life. The red dragon was seen as representing the Britons and the white dragon the Saxons, which is why to this day it's on the flag of Wales. In Nennius, writing in the 9th century, we've got a bit outside the long Victorian age, the boy is named Ambrosius Aurelianus, one of the earliest candidates for Arthur. And in Geoffrey of Monmouth, he is called Merlin, the Welsh name for Merlin, based on a real 6th century bard and seer. I must say my recent interest in all things Arthurian stems from a couple of holidays I led in Snowdonia from Craflewin Hall, which is at the foot of Dinas Emrys. It was also a time in the 19th century when these tales became popular, because there was a rise in Welsh nationalism and a revival of interest in Welsh culture and history. The first of the modernised Edfords began in 1819. And when the Marquis of Bute wanted to restore the ruin that was Cardiff Castle between 1865 and 1881, his architect, William Burgess, turned it into a medieval folly. And those slides show both the Gothic outside and the medieval inside decoration. But this is the lady we've come to look at, Charlotte Guest. The time was right for this remarkable woman, Lady Charlotte Guest. She's born in 1812, the daughter of the 9th Earl of Lindsey, and she grew up near Stamford in Lincolnshire, though a close friendship with Tennyson did not begin until 1850. In 1833, she married the industrialist Josiah John Guest, the owner of Dowlais Iron and Steel Works near Merthyr Tydfil, and moved to Wales. Here she kept a detailed journal, raised 10 children, founded schools for the children of the workers, and inspired by the antiquarian and grammarian William Owen Pugh, who died in 1835, taught herself Welsh and translated the Book of Taliesin and 11 ancient Welsh tales. These latter came to be known as the Mabinogion, a bit of a misnomer because it's not a Welsh plural. By claiming these 11 tales were part of the cycle of Celtic plays and poems which formed the matter of Britain and predated the fall of Britain to the Saxons, Lady Charlotte Guest was claiming Arthur for the Welsh at a time of rising Welsh nationalism. Her aim was to portray Wales as the cradle of the European Romance tradition. So there was a bilingual edition 1840 and a more influential one in English only in 1877, and it piggybacked on the success of Tennyson's Idylls. Collectors of porcelain in Lorraine may know her better as the wife of her second husband, Charles Schreiber. She would later live in Cranford, Dorset, where she died. Now, the Mabinogion, I'll give you a shortened version of what I was going to say. You'll be glad to hear. But there's a lot more can be said about the Mabinogion, and I'd recommend you read the Sinead Davies translation. In brief, these 11 tales consist of the original 4 branches about rulers before Arthur, including the giant Bendigeid Bran, who's pictured there, who's the brother of Branwen, whose talking decapitated head is illustrated here. It went on for 87 years after being cut off. There are also 2 dream narratives, the Emperor Maxon, who was a candidate for the original Arthur, and Cron Abui's Dream, which ends up with a chess match or the Welsh equivalent of chess, playing Owen before he'll join in a battle. There are 2 Celtic folk tales. This is Cleef and Clefellis, and you'll notice that our dragons appear in that as well as these invaders who can hear every sound, and giants who steal all their food. The Killhook and Alwyn, another Celtic tale which involves Arthur and his knights fulfilling 40 almost impossible tasks so that Killhook can marry the giant's daughter Alwyn, including being able to speak to the language of salmon and to chase a boar just because it's got a comb and shears in its head, which they need to cut the giant's beard. The giant dies as soon as Killhook marries Alban, so that's why I gave him 40 impossible tasks. But there are also these 3 romance tales which parallel those of Chrétien de Troyes, but without the same level of chivalry. Peridor is a Celtic version of Percival. Owen and the Lady of the Fountain is a good example of that Monty Pythonish custom of the castle narrative. And Geraint and Erowyn, which Tennyson read in Charlotte Guest's translation and used as the basis for 2 of his Idylls, is here as well. It's a tale of a jealous husband who is suspecting his wife of flirting with other knights and goes out on a quest with her, but he insists she must ride ahead of him, run side by side, and forbids her to speak. Erowyn breaks her promise to do so on several occasions in order to save his life. And here in this 1893 picture by Francis Muschamp, she wakes him up to warn him he's about to be attacked by a former suitor. He's not grateful though. So now it's perhaps time, because of the connection, to move on to our friend Alfred Lord Tennyson. Alfred Tennyson was born on the 6th of August 1809 in Somersby, Lincolnshire, the son of an Anglican clergyman. In 1827, he went up to Trinity College, Cambridge, where he met Arthur Hallam, the close friend whose early death at 22 inspired the series of memorial elegies that made him famous, In Memoriam, and ultimately Poet Laureate in 1850. They also inspired the Mort d'Arthur, written about the same time. Gladstone had known Arthur Hallam from Eton. From an early age, he'd been interested in Arthur and made it his lifelong ambition to write an English Arthurian epic, which was begun in 1834 and only completed 50 years later. And there's the picture of the great man again. Various pictures. The sculptures are by Thomas Woolner, his close friend and one of the original 7 members of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Tennyson's poetry was widely read and admired. Dickens even named one of his sons after him, Alfred Dorothy Tennyson Dickens. This was in 1845, after they'd met socially following Dickens' admiration for the poems that were published in 1842. And there's a close relationship between the poems of Tennyson and the artists of the day. So here we've got April Love by Arthur Hughes, which had lines from Tennyson's The Miller's Daughter inscribed on the back. So that's she's on the right-hand side. And the two paintings which draw directly on lyrics to be found in his long narrative poem, The Princess, in Millet's Autumn Leaves, inspired by Tears, Idle Tears. That's 1856. And John Melwish Strudwick's 1894, Oh Swallow, Swallow. In The Princess, with this long narrative poem of his, it's sung by the prince who has infiltrated the all-female university dressed as a woman. There are also these poems, three paintings inspired by Tennyson. There's John William Waterhouse's Lady Clare of 1900 and Burne-Jones's King Cophetua and the Beggar Maid, on a similar theme of the love of a rich man for a woman of lowly origin. And of course, John Everett Millet's Mariana of 1851. Now, this minor character in Shakespeare's Measure for Measure is abandoned by the villainous Angelo when she loses her fortune. Millet's inspiration, though, was Tennyson's 1830 poem rather than the Shakespeare play. It is perhaps the best painting for anyone who suffers from back pain I've ever known. And something more specifically Arthurian, these are two paintings which are not only medieval, but I'll say specifically Arthurian. Gwynevere with Lancelot behind her in what in the film Camelot was described as the lusty month of May. So again, feel free to burst into song if you know the song. It's a painting by John Collier of 1900. And George Frederick Watts' painting again of Sir Galahad, the only one of Arthur's knights to attain the Grail, and to quote Tennyson, believes, "My strength is as the strength of 10, because my heart is pure." In the Arthurian tales, I think I might have said this, he is the son of Lancelot, who was tricked into sleeping with Elaine, the daughter of King Pelles, the keeper of the Grail in Corbenic, by an enchantress who made him think that Elaine was Gwynevere. So the parallels here with the birth of Arthur at Tintagel are pretty obvious. But it was the Moxon Tennyson of 1857 which really caught people's imagination. It was a lavishly produced piece of work, and it showed the relationship between art and poetry most clearly. There were 30 woodcut illustrations by pre-Raphaelite artists. Tennyson unfortunately wasn't impressed and made his feelings known though, and 24 others by other Victorians artists. So on the left, you've got engravings by Rossetti and Holman Hunt, and on the right, two by Daniel Maclise. In all, Millet did 17 engravings, Hunt 6, and Rossetti 5. And here's Holman Hunt's 1905 painting, which is a variation of the earlier engraven from the Moxon edition, and Tennyson's first poem on an Arthurian subject. The engraving of the imprisoned woman shows the moment when she's defied her father's injunction not to look directly out of the window and brought down his curse upon her. You can just about see the irresistible hunk that was Sir Lancelot through the window, the weft for weaving entangled about her legs, and the wild pre-Raphaelite hair, which the conventional Tennyson found particularly objectionable. Just like my hair at the moment, actually. She left the web and she left the loom. She made 3 paces through the room. She saw the water flower bloom. She saw the helmet and the plume. She looked down to Camelot. Out flew the web and floated wide. The mirror cracked from side to side. The curse is come upon me, cried the Lady of Shalott. She's become here a dangerous, empowered woman, an enchantress aware of her sexuality. Like Adam reaching for the forbidden fruit, she has broken out in the background. She has broken out from her confinement, and her fate is sealed. And of course, it inspired other poems, other artists rather. So here's another, is John William Waterhouse's painting of the lady in her tower, looking very bored because she can only look at Camelot through the mirror. It's entitled, "I am half sick of shadows," said the Lady of Shalott. Here, rather than the femme fatale, she is the damsel in distress. And again by the same painter in 1894, at the moment when she no longer can resist the lure of Lancelot in the flesh. And perhaps the most famous one, by John William Waterhouse, of the three, is Floating Down to Camelot in 1888. The Lady of Shalott is about to die on the journey, like some bold seer in a trance. And I don't know whether there's anybody out there who likes Atkins and Grimshaw, but this is again his version of the same story. He was a real medievalist because in 1876 he built himself a turreted folly overlooking Scarborough Bay. And if you want another one, here's Arthur Hughes in 1873 with the Lady of Shalott story. She just arrived in Camelot there. And yet another Atkinson Grimshaw, this time from 1877. But here you'll notice there's a difference. This time the Lady of Shalott has company, someone to row her about. And this is because it's based on the reworking of the Lady of Shalott poem for one of the idylls of the king, Elaine, which we'll now segue into. Because he took the story and he included it. He rewrote it and included it in his idylls of the king. The book which became Tennyson's Arthurian epic, a term he rejected, was the Idylls of the King. He pronounced it idols to draw attention to the Greek word meaning a short poem, eidolion, meaning a short descriptive poem. But clearly these 12 long narrative poems of 109,000 words in total aren't that. He also liked to pronounce Tintagel with a hard G as Tintagel, but I'll continue to call his poems the Idylls and Tintagel if he doesn't mind. The Tennyson had begun writing the first of these as early as 1833, but the 12 narrative poems were not completed until 52 years later, and were not published together until 6 years after that in 1891. It really was a lifelong obsession with publications of Idylls in 1859, 1869, and 1885. And there are two notable editions of Tennyson's Idylls. The first of these, in 1868, contained 37 engravings by the French engraver Gustave Doré, who had gained fame for his illustrations of the Bible, Dante, and Cervantes. The engravings were based only on the first four Idylls, Enid, Vivian, Gwynevere, and Elaine. On the right is the original frontispiece. And there's his illustrations of Camelot and Elaine floating down the river, and Iniel, the father of Enid, who we've already met in the Mabinogion, showing Prince Geraint his ruined castle. It later became the marriage of Geraint and Enid. And Merlin, stories illustrating Merlin. Well, we'll come to his story later. That's Merlin and Vivian. And the other notable edition was the one by Julia Cameron. It was illustrated through photographs, which she got her friends to pose for. She was both, it came out in 1875, as it says there. She was both his friend and neighbour on the Isle of Wight, as well as being the aunt of the artist Val Prinsep. And the famous Dirty Monk portrait of Tennyson comes from this collection. So there's Lancelot and Gwynevere, the passing of Arthur in the boat, Vivian and Merlin, looking like she's just about to poke him in the eye, and Sir Galahad and the Pale Nun, looking a little shocked at finding himself in this rather compromising position here. This is the sister of Percival, who in the Tennyson version encourages Percival's quest, so it's all right. And the dates of the poems, Mort Darter, later renamed The Passing of Arthur, was begun as early as 1833. 8 poems were published together in 1869, another 3 in 1872, and the final poem, Balin and Balan, in 1885. By splitting his Enid poem in two, the marriage of Geraint and Enid, he achieved the magical figure of 12. But it wasn't until 1891 that all 12 were published together, the year before his death. The 12 tales tell a story: the coming of Arthur, the adventures of his knights, the threat to his kingdom, the adulterous love of Lancelot and Guinevere, the search for the Holy Grail, and the end of Camelot with the final battle and the passing of Arthur. Yet the whole, excuse me, the whole disparate narrative is framed by a conventional dedication. At the beginning to Prince Albert, who died in 1861, and at the end to Queen Victoria. Tennyson saw Albert as representing the ideal ruler, an Arthur-like muscular Christianity, ideal manhood clothed in real man, in contrast to flawed modern manhood represented by Lancelot and Gawain, and no doubt myself. Not everyone agreed. Swinburne mockingly referred to them as idols of the Prince Consort, while T.S. Eliot later said, Tennyson made of this great British epic material, in Malory, hearty, outspoken and magnificent, to suitable reading for a girls' school. So a touch of T.S. Eliot on misogyny there. Significantly, Tennyson makes no reference to Arthur's unwitting but incestuous relationship with his half-sister Morgause, which led to the birth of Mordred, both his son and nephew, which Malory hadn't ignored, or the Herod-like directive to kill all the firstborn once he finds out. Queen Victoria made Tennyson Poet Laureate in 1850 after the death of Wordsworth and after Samuel Rogers had turned it down. Tennyson's moralising high Middle Ages imperial Arthur was a good fit for the Victorian age. There are 12 idylls, which I'll rattle through very quickly, I promise you. There's the Coming of Arthur, painted by Charles Ernest Butler, as we've seen, the first of the idylls. He admits that the bed trick whereby Merlin transforms Uther to look like Gulwaz, Igraine's queen. Gareth and Lynette, the Overthrowing the Rusty Knight by Arthur Hughes in 1908. Gareth is one of those fair unknowns, a common Arthurian motif. He starts off working in the kitchen as a scullery boy for Sir Kai, who's a notorious bully, and he's knighted and eventually wins the heart of the damsel who first spurns him, called Lynette. There's the one we mentioned already. The next two idylls are based on the tale in the Mabinogion, which Tennyson had read. Originally it was one long poem called Enid, but split into two. And Enid's punishment is that she has to ride ahead of Geraint without speaking. As a consequence, she is the first to see any number of attackers, tells Geraint, and it gets told off for speaking, and then has to ride on ahead again when they've been defeated. The popularity of the idylls can be evidenced by such things as the Art Union of London competition of 1860, which invited entries for competition to illustrate them. There were 43 entries, and it was won by Paolo Priol, an artist little known now, but regarded as an important book illustrator in the 1860s. So here's an engraving for the end of Enid, where the faithful wife begs assistance for her fallen husband. I don't think he deserved her, to be honest. And then the one which is written last, but is included fifth in the collection, Balin and Balan, a strange tale of two brothers who are reconciled to Arthur and end up killing each other by mistake. One we might spend have a good look at is the sixth idyll, Merlin and Vivian, which shares its subject with the famous 1877 painting by Edward Burne-Jones. In this version, Merlin is consumed with lust for Nimue, another name for Vivian, also associated with the Lady of the Lake and called Nina in the one Arthurian poem written by Wordsworth, the Egyptian maid. And we see him at the point of betrayal when he realizes that she has seduced him in order to gain his magic powers. As a seer, he can foresee his future, but so powerful is the attraction of his lust for Vivian that he cannot help himself. Once he has his secrets, she confinds him in an oak tree, according to Tennyson, or a hawthorn tree, according to Burne-Jones, or under a great stone, according to Malory. For Tennyson, the story is allegorical: wisdom, intellect, and knowledge unable to resist the temptation of sex. Power is thrown away for the sake of sexual passion. The battle between the soul and the flesh was one of Tennyson's perennial themes. And there's the full picture on the right. The model for Burne-Jones' painting was his mistress, Maria Zambaco, and so is doubly poignant. For Tennyson, she's a femme fatale, a dangerous female enchantress. Burne-Jones' painting is more ambivalent. The book she is holding in her hand is the Book of Magic Spells she's wheedled out of Merlin, but Dorry shows them resting in the forest of Brocéliande. It seems to suggest a mutual attraction between them, which is more like the early French romances than the one-sided seduction seen in Tennyson. Another of the idols is the seventh one, Lancelot and Alwyn. The painting is by George William Joy from 1890 about Lancelot and Alwyn, a variation of the Lady of Shalott story. Lancelot leaves his shield with Alwyn, wins the tournament, but goes back to Camelot to present the jewels which with a prize to Gwynevere, ignoring Alwyn, who nursed him back to health. As so often happens in Arthurian legends, Gwynevere is enraged by jealousy and throws the jewels out of the window. Alwyn subsequently dies of grief. In some versions, she starves herself to death and is rowed down to Camelot. And then there is the Holy Grail. The Tennyson's Grail poem is told in flashback by Sir Percival. This is our next talk on the Tractarians, but many high Anglicans still in tune with Tractarianism and the Oxford movement would have been sympathetic to the story as symbolic of a spiritual search for perfection. But Tennyson toned down the more specifically Catholic aspects of the finding of the Grail because it didn't fit with his own ideas of Protestant restraint. By comparison with Galahad, said Percival, is a failed Grail Quest knight. And here's a more non-Tennysonian glorious representation of the Grail by the American artist Edwin Austin Abbey in 1895. It's called The Golden Tree and the Achievement of the Grail. It's one of a series of murals installed in the Boston Public Library between 1895 and 1902. The next idol, number 9, the picture on the left is Pelleas, taken from the Oxford Union Debating Hall. Pelleas was known as the Gentle Knight, who, having fallen in love with Lady Etar, is spurned by him. She actually sends knights out to drag him back into a castle and tie him up. And she treats him with absolute contempt. His cause is then taken up by Sir Gawain, but his rescuer ends up seducing Etar, making his judgment of Gwynevere in Malory and Morris all the more hypocritical. The quote is when Etar sees them sleeping together, lays his swords across their throats, but mercifully leaves them to it, and just so he knows that they've been there. The last tournament, here is the Tristram again. This is A Knight by Kate Elizabeth Bunce, supposedly based on Tristram. It's all the rules of chivalry are broken, but Tristram emerges victorious, returns to Tintagel with a prize of rubies to give to Isolde. The idyll ends with his death, though, at the hands of King Mark, and a sombre note, a death, dumb, autumn dripping gloom, which prefigures the end of days for Camelot when Arthur returns. The painting is, as I said, by Kate Elizabeth Bunce and is 1894. Gwynevere, now we met her in William Morris's poem, but this is the penultimate idyll. It deals with Mordred spying on Gwynevere and the revelation of this to Arthur. The kingdom is broken. Gwynevere flees to a nunnery at Amesbury on the edge of Salisbury Plain. Here, Arthur finds her, harangues her for her disloyalty, and then forgives her before going off to fight his traitorous nephew, Mordred. Overcome with grief and guilt, Gwynevere becomes a nun and later an abbess. In Tennyson's version, Gwynevere says nothing but throws herself grovelling in a gesture of guilt and repentance. Modern commentators see this as quite a disturbing image, particularly when in Malory, Arthur shares the blame for the destruction of Camelot because of his incestuous and adulterous relationship with Morgause, even though it was unintended. For Tennyson, Arthur was a Christ-like figure, as Gwynevere describes him in Alwyn and Lancelot. Arthur, my lord, Arthur, the faultless king, that passionate perfection, my good lord, but who can gaze upon the sun in heaven? We're reminded, I think, of Milton's lines in Paradise Lost. He for God only, and she for God in him. And perhaps some lines also from The Princess by Tennyson, which are no doubt controversial today. Man for the field and woman for the hearth, man for the sword and for the needle she, man with the head and woman with the heart, man to command and woman to obey, all else confusion. Not my views, I quickly hasten to add. So Gwynevere can be seen as an idealized queen, the epitome of goodness and purity, or as the femme fatale whose sinfulness destroyed Camelot. For Morris, she is a much more admirable character. And here you've got the accolade by Frederick Leighton, 1901, My Fair Lady by Edmund Blair Leighton, 1914, and a James Archer painting of 1860. And there she is on the left at the stake. In Morris, as for Mallory, Queen Gwynevere is condemned to death at the stake before being rescued by Lancelot and then becoming a nun. In Tennyson, she becomes a nun straight away, as seen in these illustrations from W. Russell Flint's version of Morte d'Arthur in 1910 and Georgia Wollstonecraft Reed in 1898. I think I've only included one of those. Lancelot will later become a hermit, and in some versions, a priest. And the final Eidolon, it is actually the one he wrote in 1833 with some lines added at the beginning and end. And it is a little different in style to the others, but it's perhaps both the most famous and most readable. It's the same as Morte d'Arthur of 1833. It tells of the wounded Arthur carried to the shore by his loyal cupbearer, Sir Bedivere, and Sir Lucan. Sir Lucan dies, his butler, but Sir Bedivere carries on. And it's seen here in this 1860 painting by Arthur Hughes. I think I'll let you read the passing of Arthur while I take a drink. I'm going to move on. The story then turns to the returning of Arthur's magical sword to the Lady of the Lake, who had given it to Arthur. It's a different sword, of course, from the one drawn from the stone. He had two. This is an 1881 engraving showing how Excalibur was obtained originally by Arthur and Merlin in Malory's poem. But in the final idyll, we get Sir Bedivere being given the task of returning Excalibur to the lake, but he can't do it because he's so impressed with its beauty. He hides the sword behind a tree, but each time Arthur knows he hasn't done the deed. It's only when sent back for the third time that he manages to fulfill Arthur's command, and he sees her arm clothed in white samite, mystic, wonderful, taking the sword. So there's a parallel here with the Celtic practice of offering weapons to the other world by depositing them in liminal places like lakes. And again, I'll let you read that. Then, as the ship approaches to take Arthur to Avalon, Bedivere is filled with regret and has this final exchange with the king. But now the whole round table is dissolved, which was an image of the mighty world, and I, the last, go forth companionless, and the day is darkened around me, and the years, among new men, strange faces, other minds, and slowly answered Arthur from the barge, the old world changeth, yielding place to new. And then Arthur is borne away in a ship with Morgan Le Fay and Nimue in Mallory to Avalon. So said he, and the barge with oar and sail moved from the brink like some full-breasted swan that flung a wild carol ere her death, ruffles her pure cold plume and takes the flood with swarthy webs. Long stood Sir Bedivere, revolving many memories, till the whole looked one black dot against the verge of the dawn, and on the mere the wailing died away. In other versions of the story, slightly different emphasis. Here's The Death of King Arthur by James Archer from 1860. It's a different reimagining. He's a Scottish artist. In this picture, Arthur is surrounded by Tennyson's three queens of Avalon, who lay him in the barge, named by Mallory as the Queen of North Galles, North Wales, the Queen of the Wasteland, Elaine of Corbinic, and Morgan Le Fay, the Queen of Orkney. On the beach are Merlin and Nimue in deep conversation. She's the Lady of the Lake, while Howell the Dying King, and to his right is the vision of the Grail. You can just about see it transparent above the head of the Weeping Maid. This is Burne-Jones' interpretation. This is James Archer's interpretation. In Arthurian legend, Morgan and Nimue are therefore both ambivalent figures, plotters and destroyers, as well as healers and protectors. And here, from 1898, is Burne-Jones' painting, The Last Sleep of Arthur in Avalon. Tennyson says that Arthur is going to Avalon, but does not describe the scene shown here. This is Burne-Jones's interpretation, painted in 1898, 6 years after Tennyson's death, and clearly indicates that the legend of King Arthur lived on after Tennyson, and his influence in popularising legend is unquestionable. And the same picture with a close-up. And again. The end is nigh, I promise you. There's a further close-up of the Last Sleep of Arthur by Burne-Jones, 1898. There's a sign we're coming to an end. So with that lovely picture of Halil and Hildebrand, the meeting of the turret squares, which is Ireland's by William Burton. In 2012, it was voted Ireland's favourite painting. So there was a life, an Arthurian life after Tennyson. His influence went on. Books continued to be written and republished long after Tennyson's death. James Noel had been the architect of Tennyson's medieval mansion at Blackdown in Sussex, but gained fame himself with his King Arthur and his Knights, published first in 1860, but reprinted 7 times during the last years of the 19th century and well into the 20th. So this is a 1923 edition. And the same could be said of the American Sidney Lanier, who published a boys' edition of both the King Arthur stories and the Mabinogion, both beautifully illustrated by N.C. Wyeth, as was Howard Pyle's The Story of King Arthur and His Knights in 1903. And in 1889, Mark Twain challenged the medieval feudalism he saw in Victorian society in his A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. Twain blamed outmoded concepts of chivalry, especially those espoused by Sir Walter Scott, as leading to the American Civil War, so was keen to debunk it. But the more moralizing versions by Sidney Lanier, 1880, and Howard Pyle continued to be popular. And painters also, Edmund Leighton especially, continued to paint. Here's Godspeed by Edmund Leighton, exhibited in 1900, so within our timescale. And 2 more which weren't, The Dedication, 1908, and Stitching the Standard, 1911. But perhaps we ought to end the talk by talking about what is why was it so important to the Victorians? What did it mean to them? And I've suggested here that it's the time, of course, of Luke Files, the 1874 painting of the Casual Ward and the Dowlice steelworks, and yet people were still interested in the story of King Arthur. I've suggested 3 things. Firstly, it's a reaction against industrialization. Clearly, Arthurian legends are escapists. They're a great many layers story which people still enjoy today. They also reflect the romantic movement of ideas where imagination, idealism, and beauty triumph over reason, reality, and the ugliness of post-industrial Britain. I think also the second reason is the Arthur story feeds into ideas of national identity and pride. In England and Wales was seen, but also in post-Franco-Prussian War Germany, where Wagner's Tristan and Isolde and Parsifal caught the mood of the nation. Tennyson made much of the parallels between the monarchy at the heart of Camelot and that in 19th century England. For Tennyson, the story is a triumphal celebration of monarchy and empire. The conquest of subject peoples and the expansion of empire was seen as a chivalric gesture to extend Englishness to the rest of the world. So I'm sure that's what Cecil Rhodes, standing on Africa, is thinking. And Britain's wars in the Crimea, for example, were regarded as righteous, patriotic, and an opportunity to demonstrate muscular Christianity, as Arthur and his knights had done. And then I think finally that there's the connection with the feeling of unease in the country in the 1880s, because it's not a story which ends happily. It's a reflection on British hegemony, which was being challenged by the rise of other powerful nations, such as Germany and America. And then there was the challenge to paternalism embodied in the femme fatale and the destructive power of sex, which seemed to have obsessed Tennyson and perhaps reminded the Victorians of their own double standards. And at the heart of the legends of King Arthur is a sense of loss and nostalgia. Camelot was no more. And yet, it also appealed to the Victorians who started to become great literary tourists. This is the hotel called Camelot, a bit of a blot on the landscape, if I'm honest, which was built in 1809 to capitalise on the ongoing popularity of Malory and Tennyson. It's on the cliffs overlooking the ruins of the castle at Tintagel, Arthur's birthplace, allegedly. And this is the headland today on the north coast of Cornwall. It's still a magical place which draws thousands of tourists, as it drew Tennyson in 1848 when researching his epic. And there's Merlin's Cave, or the view from Merlin's Cave. It would therefore seem to be appropriate to end the talk here with two paintings by the American landscape artist William Trust Richards, who visited Tintagel in 1878, and leave the last word to Tennyson, who at Sadler University had discovered Malory and outlined the plan for the epic he would complete 52 years later. It explains, I think, the magic of King Arthur, which I believe is still with us today. So this is what Tennyson wrote when he was a young man out of university. And when he started to do his planning. On the latest limit of the west, in the land of Lyonesse, where, save the rocky isles of Scilly, all is now wild sea, rose the sacred mount of Camelot. It rose from the deeps with gardens and bowers and palaces, and at the top of the mount was King Arthur's hall and the holy minster with a cross of gold. Here dwelt the king in glory apart, while the Saxons, whom he had overthrown in 12 battles, ravaged the land and ever came nearer and nearer. The mount was the most beautiful in the world, sometimes green and fresh in the beam of morning, sometimes all one splendour, folded in the golden mists of the west. But all underneath it was hollow, and the mountain trembled when the seas rushed bellowing through the porphyry caves. And there ran a prophecy that the mountain and the city on some wild morning would topple into the abyss and be no more. It was night. The king sat in his hall. Beside him sat the sumptuous Gwynevere, and about him all his lords and knights of the Table Round. There he feasted, and when the feast was over, the bards sang to the king's glory, as indeed we're still doing today. So thank you for bearing with that long talk.